You're listening to Aman FM, your national English radio station. I'm Talal al-Shahri, and I must say I'm honored today to have with us in the studio someone whose voice usually we only hear in the darkest times of humanity, especially when it comes to children. We have with us James Elder, who is the official spokesperson for UNICEF. Welcome, Mr. Elder. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Talal, good to be here.
Pleasure is all ours. Such an illustrious career, which honestly, it's been really hard to read up on you even over the course of a few weeks, just with everything that you've been doing. So I want to hear it from you directly. Starting off, the simplest question. Where were you born in Australia?
I was born in a country town, so a small place, about 25,000 people, so between Sydney and Canberra. And so, whenever people ask me where you're from, you say Australia, but if they know the place, it's from a country town because, that first 15 years is important. And it was a small place, but it was a small place where you learnt to, be able to talk to the local janitor or plumber and also talk to a local solicitor. So it was a good background. It was a good community. I learnt very much from my folks about being part of a community. They did a lot of stuff for free. They did a lot of community work, mental health work, Rotary, all those things. So you just see those things. You don't even know that you're learning them, but you're seeing how important it is to give a bit of time back. So yeah, country town.
Okay. What happened at 15 though? Where did you...
Went to school in Sydney for a few years,
Okay.
Which was a really generous decision of theirs in a way, because I knew that now I know how much that would have cost them, and they didn't do it really for the education. They did it, I think, to give me a choice between living in country rural Australia and seeing what big city life looked like, at least to make that decision to see what I wanted to do later. So it was pretty selfless of them because it can't have been cheap. So a few years at school in Sydney and then university and then backpacking like so many Australians do.
Okay, and let's jump over to the backpacking for a minute. Where did you backpack? Mainly within Australia or across the world? Where were your destinations? And do you have any memory that pops out of you into your head when you think of the backpacking?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, the standard European thing, but then we wanted in a combi van, not uncommon for Australians to do that, living on, $10, $15 a day, but then wanted to see more and then went right across Turkey, then down through Syria. Things stick into my mind, particularly given what happened in Syria starting, 10 years ago. So spending, a week or so in Aleppo, getting a real sense. If you're Australian, when you come and you start to see that sort of history across this part of the world, it really sinks in. And of course, it's a completely foreign world and you don't know anything about it. And then all of a sudden you're meeting people absolutely randomly and not just being invited in for tea, but being invited into their homes. So you start to learn that level of hospitality. So I got the travel bug very, very quickly and would then go back and work for 6 months in London and keep doing this, and then traveled in South America for 6 months, wanted to learn Spanish. So really kept doing it, and it honestly never really left. There is a great, intrigue in meeting people from other cultures. There is a great privilege in listening to their stories, and somehow that segued, I think, a little bit into this work.
So would you say that your backpacking and your cultural travels and finding out so much is what may have led you towards media, or is there something else that helps?
No, there's no doubt. I wanted to try and tell people stories. I was absolutely incredulous at what the way some people lived, what some people did, and those basic stories too, I think, is what I remember seeing. Never forget in Peru meeting families, indigenous families, and to many people, their lives would have been fairly mundane. To me, they were absolutely extraordinary, how the way they would start at 5 o'clock in the morning with the sun and how they would end the day at 10 o'clock, and the lengths they went to educate the children, the lengths they went to grow crops with very little support elsewhere. I thought these stories were amazing and all needed to be told. So that's what got me interested into not hard news, even though I liked politics, but mostly just to really dig into, get under the carpet, get under the skin of real people's stories.
What was your first job in media?
My first job for the media was working for a very simple magazine in Sydney, and I got very lucky because the whole magazine pretty much moved to Melbourne, so I became the outsourced person. So suddenly I was doing the sports, the travel, the arts, the culture, the crime, and that gave me an insight into all of it, to be perfectly honest. So that was a bit of fortune that came out of nowhere.
What year was that when you first started?
Goodness me, now we're going to show my age. That would have been,
You're looking good. You're looking good,
mid-90s.
James. Mid-90s.
Mid-90s. I was mid-20s, yeah.
So you start off at this newspaper. What was your next step after that?
So I was there for a few years, and then the Olympics came to Sydney in 2000, and I got a job. Oh dear, you're making me think, Talal. I got a job as an editor of a publication at the Sydney Olympic Broadcasting Authority, and I thought that was going to take me and meet. I would meet all the global broadcasters from around the world. Wouldn't that be fascinating? What I actually found out was it was sort of editing a technical magazine, a technical publication. You'd understand that from your work. Where do the cameras go? How long are the cables? So fortunately, at that point, I had a fabulous girlfriend, now my wife, and I was complaining to her after a couple of weeks, and she said, look, you got the job. If you don't like it, you'll quit and get another one. And from that, I started freelance journalism, and that was wonderful. I just wrote for all sorts of magazines and newspapers. I did profiles of people. I loved that part of work. I traveled a lot with it, so I learned a couple of things. And I learned that if you've got a job that you don't like, the best time to look for another job is when you've got one, and also be willing to take the plunge. I went backpacking again. Everyone said you were crazy to do that. You've got a job now. It'll be very hard to get one again. Didn't really make sense to me. I thought the hardest time to get a job would be the first time. So my girlfriend, now wife, and I traveled to India for 6 months. She was a TV producer. And a TV host. So, we took the plunge again, but, everyone used to say in Australia, backpacking's the best thing you did. And I thought it was. I didn't understand why you'd only do it once.
Did you meet the Dalai Lama while you were there in India?
Yes. Okay. Yes, we did. Yeah, we had a great entrance into Buddhism. Dalai Lama in Dharamsala in the north of India. Yes, we did. We went to his temple, met him there. He advised that we go further north to Ladakh, which is sort of the last Shangri-La, the Himalayas of India, which we did, and spent the most peaceful of all months there. So, yeah, India's a continent unto itself. I would go back to India in a flash to travel for a period of time.
Okay, well, that sounds lovely, and I hope you do get the chance to do that. Now, if I head on over to your LinkedIn, it says you've met the Dalai Lama, you've interviewed many great people, and you've gotten into a light boxing match with the lightweight champion of the world in boxing, and that you still have all your teeth. Are those all your real teeth?
These are all my real teeth indeed.
And I believe jumping off of tall buildings as well. Might we go into a quick foray of these mini stories in your journey and adventure? That was the fun part
of the freelancing. It was a time in Australia where they had a lot of these sort of magazines of for blokes. There are a lot of sports in them. There are a lot of interviews with sports people. So the boxer was a guy called Kosta Zoo, a Russian who came to Australia, who was also, by the way, one of the most intelligent, literate men I've met. He read a book a week, and it was a story to go boxing with him for him for a couple of rounds, took a few blows. I did things like bull riding. I got sent to the middle of the country to ride a bull, which was something that lasted about 3 seconds, and afterwards, after I got thrown off, ended up underneath the bull. But the adrenaline was running, and the guy who owned the bull said, "You've done really well with that. You've got to go again." Which, of course, the photographer was saying, "Don't be mad. I've got the photograph." But the adrenaline was there, and I believed him, so I did it again. But didn't work out quite so well. So bungee jumping, all those kinds of things. It was just you were being paid as long as you could write and make it as fun as it was. I was being paid to do lots of things that were highly entertaining in my late 20s.
So, obviously, you've said it yourself. You weren't very interested in politics and the like when you started off your journalism career, and you worked in a lot of very fun ideas, cultural ideas, spiritual journeys, and very physical journeys as well. 2002, Angola, UNICEF. How did that come about?
Yeah, it's a great question, Talal. I think so. I'd always, as I say, growing up and learning, even through osmosis, just the benefits of service. I'd always understood that. And now I'd backpacked and I had seen these incredible lives. I'd seen people, in Australia, if you're born middle class, you learn pretty quickly that the lottery of birth, you've been very, very fortunate. And I think both my wife and I realized we wanted to find ways to give back, but weren't quite sure what that was. And then through a friend of hers who I met, very random contact, and we kept in touch, just essentially lamenting the state of politics in Australia. And he emailed me completely out of the blue. He was working for UNICEF. He had been sent to Angola with Mia Farrow, who was a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, one of the great actors. And he had been asked by the head of office for UNICEF in Angola for someone like him, someone who did media. And he thought of me, and I'll never forget the email. I was working from home in Bondi Beach in Australia, and it said, "James, would you like to work in Angola? It's not easy, but it's a rare way into the United Nations." Now, at this point, we had a 1-year-old, so we were consumed by, just the preciousness of children. My wife and I went for a walk with her in a pram, and we mustn't have got more than 100 meters, and we're both like, "Of course we do. Absolutely. Never been to Africa." Said yes, then did some research on Angola and realized it wasn't really a place of elephants and lions. Angola had more landmines than children. Angola had endemic malaria. But that was our beginning. It was a very, very difficult place to work. I was very lucky. It was a family duty station. I was very lucky my wife is as selfless and tough as she is. There was very little freedom to get out. It was, buy water every week. A lot of lack of security, incredibly expensive, tough to learn the language. She was pregnant and malaria, but we learnt so much. I had an amazing boss. I got to understand all the basics of what humanitarian work was, why vaccination, why education, why the value of these things, and I mean economic value, not just the ethical value. So it was a leap into the unknown, but it was one that was the beginning, as you say, of this particular journey.
So how long did you stay in Angola for?
2 years. We were there for 2 years. We got there at the very end of 2002, which was when the civil war had ended, and that was Africa's longest running civil war. And it was broken, truly broken. I think I travelled so much, and as I say, travelling around Syria and Jordan and these places and South America, that level of hospitality is not a cliche. It's immense what the average person will offer you. And I got to Angola, and no, Angolan people were heavy-hearted. They'd just been through so much. This was a place where, highest child mortality, highest number of children as a percentage dying on the planet, horrific levels of poverty. So it was a very, very tough place. I was already very, very aware of our own fortune, but it was a time to go, all right, well, this is no longer about realizing that, realizing we're lucky. This is about putting that into practice. What can we do? And I had a really good boss who wasn't just emotive about, yes, it's about the children. He was like, all right, give me a strategy. How do we improve that? How do we protect these children here? How do we find them jobs? How do we get them out of the rubbish tips? How do we make sure the government puts money behind vaccination? So I learned a lot, whether it was talking to government ministers or whether it was talking to the media. But it was a tough place, and I owe my wife a lot at that point because, there was not a lot going on for a mum with a baby, a pregnant mum with a baby in a place as tough and insecure as Luanda, the capital of Angola at that time.
I don't know if you still keep tabs on Angola, but 23 years later, it's 2025, and we've seen, Oman has just signed a bunch of agreements with Angola to help build up their economy there, food security, and more. Looking at Angola as it is now, how do you feel that growth has been from someone who experienced it in 2002?
It's a great question. Look, I haven't, I have a global role, but of course in the last few years that's been very heavily occupied by the, Gazas and Sudans and Democratic Republic of Congos and Haitis and Ukraines. So I don't know it well. Certainly I do know that there is immense youthful potential. When you have a population where more than half your population is young people, then you have, in the most simplistic sense, Talal, two options. You have this youth dividend. You get that population educated, then you will have a demographic dividend, which is enormous for a country. If you don't, then you risk this kind of demographic disaster. So Angola is kind of on a precipice in that sense. So the kind of support you're talking about that Oman is offering is critical right now, absolutely critical, because you direct that youthful population and educate them in a place like that, then the entire society benefits. It's not a big population. I think it's around 30 million people. And if they're not given those skills and not given those livelihoods, then you have a very different outcome.
Yeah, I would guess that eventually knowing how your work has succeeded would be by knowing less and less about these countries over time because you're not needed there anymore.
Yeah, quite. I hope so.
I hope that is a success, inshallah. Okay, so 2 years in Angola. At this point, you have 2 children. And where do you go to next?
So in the way the United Nations works, you apply, you look to other places. I felt I'd learned an enormous amount in Angola. I definitely wanted to stay in Southern Africa. I went to Zimbabwe at that point. I think that I was aware that of the communication work, that emergency work was something that I was well suited to, if I can say that. And Zimbabwe were one of the success stories, the success story at the time of Southern Africa. The breadbasket of Southern Africa, the best education rates, the best training of nurses, so much so that there was a terrible brain drain to the United Kingdom because they were trained in that same kind of NHS way. So start of 2005 to Zimbabwe, to Harare.
Since Sri Lanka, you've been to many a country. You've seen conflict in places like Haiti, you've seen conflict in Afghanistan, Ukraine, of course, more recently Gaza, which we will get to. Was there ever a point in your journey, seeing all this conflict and seeing all what was happening to these children, was there ever a point where your confidence was shaken and you thought, can I keep doing this after seeing all this in front of me?
Yes, without a doubt. Yes. But I think time... one of the greatest challenges to this work is exactly that, is seeing, children with, for example, the wounds of war, with seeing mums who have walked for 20 kilometres after having been subject to horrific levels of abuse, and hearing their stories and hearing that time and again. But at the same time, if I'm not in those positions, I also don't, for example, meet those little girls who go to school for the first time and see that face, watch the expression of a mum who is vaccinating her child. So those things keep you going. There is no doubt to that. And I think also sometimes, there is definitely, I can certainly think of them in Gaza, certainly even think of them in Ukraine, but at the same, where I feel like it's enough, it's too much. But again, I fall back on that very fortunate first 15 years of a gentle country town and think almost, get over it, James. There is something bigger at play here. So I have a reservoir, if you will, of goodwill and good luck to draw upon. So it's a mix of seeing those success stories, and that's what I'm very fortunate to see those work out through UNICEF, as a balancing act against, so many of the atrocities that unfortunately seem like they're increasing at the moment in terms of vulnerability of children and so on, and a lack of empathy. It seems like things are getting worse, but at the moment, no, I feel if ever there was a time to double down in our support for kids, it's now.
In what way, from your own experience, do you see how things are getting worse? We hope that they will get better, but we have to look at the reality of the matter. What is making things get worse right now on a worldwide perspective?
I think the international humanitarian law can sound quite vague to people, but it's a bedrock that has helped countries around the world make sure that there are basic, levels of safety for all sorts of countries. And international humanitarian law is not the roof; it's the bare minimum. And we are seeing consistent violations of international humanitarian law. We are seeing governments disregard things such as international humanitarian law, and these was meant to be the systems that governments put in place to protect, most importantly, the most vulnerable of all, which are children. Now, children are the most vulnerable. That's not a nice statement. That's an absolute statement of fact, simply because, they are the youngest. They have the immune systems that are the weakest, and so on and so forth. So I think consistently we've seen countries disregard those most basic things. And when that happens, if we start to get to a point where countries go back to an idea that, might is right, then everyone ultimately loses. We see this in Sudan right now. We see right now power plays in Sudan right now, whereby there is a risk of doing enormous damage to that country, which will have huge spill-on effects, not just for Sudanese who've suffered for too long, but for many, many other countries in the region. So, yeah, I do think at the moment we are seeing violations in countries that we haven't seen before, and not enough other nations speak out very clearly about them.
To fixate on Sudan for a minute, many people have been saying, oh, the world is not speaking enough about Sudan, the world is not doing enough for Sudan. And there's a lot happening there. When you hear the numbers of people who've been displaced, people who've been killed, the numbers are just as high as places like Gaza, for example, and many different metrics. What is unfolding there right now that should alarm the world when it comes to the situation?
Yeah, it's a great question, Talal. Numbers are always dangerous because I think people get exhausted by them, and understandably so. But Sudan is the world's biggest protection crisis. It's the world's biggest displacement crisis. By that I mean 5 million girls and boys have been displaced. Now I think that's almost the population of Oman. No, Oman's maybe a little bit more than that, but 5 million girls and boys have been displaced. And there's a risk even just to take displacement. When we talk displacement, it can sound quite gentle, but there's nothing gentle about displacement. It's violent. It's ongoing. It's when a girl or a boy in the middle of the night, is suddenly woken from their home and is forced to flee, grabbing whatever they can. And it often happens more than once. They lose that sense of safety. They lose any access to education. So 5 million children is an astronomical number. There is famine in Sudan. There's a lot of discussion. Was there famine in Gaza? Was there not? The United Nations was very clear for a long time that the blockades were going to lead to that, and unfortunately that's what happened. But at the same time, there's famine in Sudan, and yet again, it's man-made famine. So whether it's the famine that's affecting children, the displacement, the level of violence that we've just seen recently, all those things to a population that has suffered them previously. I was in Darfur 20 years ago. Now, so I met, I met families then that had endured that. I met 5, 6, 7-year-old children who survived that. Then most recently, 20 years later, you're meeting these 20-somethings. You're meeting these incredible young people who have fled, and they are engineering students, they're medical students, but they're in Chad as refugees and they have nothing. This is again a tremendous brain drain. So countries can't afford to lose that kind of quality. And that's what Sudan's got, because surprise, surprise, when people have so very little, they work incredibly hard across one main factor, which is to get their kids educated. And if we lose that in Sudan, if you go through 3, 4, 5 years without that level of education, that is a very, very big country to have had a lost generation of children.
It is, truly so. We keep coming back to education over and over as something that we see in many of these countries that you've been through. Education is key. How is it now for the people of Gaza, children who've been without schools now for over 2 years? And before we even look at the numbers or look at what's happening, are we looking at another lost generation in Palestine?
Yeah, I mean, Gaza's children are some of the best educated, or Gaza's adults are some of the best educated, highest literacy rates in the world. That means irrespective of all the crises that they've been hit with over years and years and decades, mums and dads and grandparents always focused on education. It's extraordinary, and it's one of the reasons why when I would go there, when I would walk around a hospital in Gaza, when I would walk over wounded children on the floors, when another mother would say, please come and talk to me about my child, and I would think, how can the stories always somehow, there should be a sameness to them. I'm talking time and again to girls and boys who have had amputation, girls and boys who've had their homes struck in the middle of the night and have horrific wounds. When I talk to the families of these children, or sometimes the children if they're conscious, every single story is slightly different. Now, the only reason that is the case is because of that literacy rate. There's an articulation that enables them to share the intricacies of those stories. There is a reason why Palestinians, during that ceasefire earlier this year, why it bounced back so quickly. I wasn't there for that, but colleagues, my friend Palestinians who I've become friends with, would explain to me, Talal, they'd say, "Oh, James, you should have been here. You know, we were having cappuccino and cake on day one, and the supermarkets were full. Really, like brilliant supermarkets like you would find here in your own city. And there's a reason for that. That's just wasn't by chance. It was because of that literacy rates, because they had systems in place. They have engineers, they have nurses, they have logisticians. That's how they bounce back. The threat of losing that now is the greatest fear in Gaza. And that's a terrible list to be on top of, because, of course, there's been a systematic destruction to a health system, to a sanitation system. But when you have destroyed or damaged 9 out of 10 schools, then yes, the immediacy that the world needs, the region needs to focus on education is yesterday. Everything, of course, needs work in Gaza. We have unprecedented levels of trauma of girls and boys, the hospitals, the homes. But it's the mums and dads and the grandparents who want their kids back into some sort of learning. And right now that is not happening to nearly the level it needs to.
Looking at how things are now, post-alleged ceasefire, what is the situation from your colleagues on the ground who are in Gaza, as far as you know?
Yeah, it's not good, Talal. It's winter. And so it's now the third winter as well. So that's a third winter for families in the same tent that's now got rips in it, because for a long, long time, Israeli authorities would still ban, access to so many things, medicine, education supplies, but also to tents. So families are in tents. Every time a family gets displaced, as we talk about, they lose something. They add a little bit of trauma, but they lose clothes, they lose what they could carry, they lose maybe another blanket. So it's winter, it's cold, it's wet. And even I'm in touch with people every day, so I could show you on my phone the videos people share. So what that means is, it means it's raining and that you're in a tent and the rain's coming through, and you've been living in that tent for a long period of time. So look, the bombs have stopped, mostly. Still, more than 70 children have been killed since the ceasefire. Of course, 20,000 prior to that. So, okay, that's an improvement, but not to the level we want. So there is still a lack of healthcare for people. There is absolutely a lack of housing. There is absolutely a lack of education. And I think, Talal, there's a risk right now that in a most simple sense, you could split, this is a generalization, but split people into two categories who are watching the horrors unfold in Gaza over the last 2 years. And one, we're watching it and we're eminently aware of the atrocities being committed. And right now, those people are just so desperate for it to be over. Right? They're so mentally exhausted by seeing that. And then another were probably just ignoring it or pretending it wasn't happening at all. And they're so guilty, they want it to be over. So there's large portions of people who think, okay, ceasefire, tell me it's getting better. And I understand that. I absolutely do. I talk to my own children who've been watching it and all of their friends. And it's a huge mental toll on people around the world, around the region. But the biggest toll, of course, is for Palestinians in Gaza, and it's not over. So this is not the time for people to take their eyes off it. It's not the time for people to stop putting pressure on ensuring that Israel allows in everything that is needed and ensure that there are no more airstrikes at any time, and ensuring that, we have the kind of support that is in the billions of dollars. The rebuilding is astronomical, of course, but for Palestinians, it has to start today.
You've been to Gaza 6 times over the past 2+ years since this all began. And I'm curious how UNICEF is being treated in comparison to UNRWA, who have been getting a lot of pushback from the Knesset, from the IDF, etc. You're both United Nations agencies. How easy or hard is it to get in there and to do your work? And is it the same as UNRWA, or are things more or easier for you?
It's definitely more difficult for UNRWA. There was a statement always made by all United Nations agencies from the Secretary General down that UNRWA is the backbone. And that's not a cliche. That is because UNRWA is 10, 12,000 people on the ground. That's teachers, that's health staff. Everyone relies on UNRWA, all other United Nations agencies. And so definitely it's more difficult for UNRWA than anyone else, without a doubt. I can only speak in terms of, for UNICEF though, everything is challenging. We navigate through the halls of power, be they in Israel, be they in other countries, to make it very clear the supplies that we need, to access on the ground what we need to do. It's a constant negotiation. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the challenges to get in tents, to get in antigens, to get in all these things. So it's difficult. Those negotiations are day in, day out. I have very, very brave colleagues on the ground. Because, yes, now there is a ceasefire, as you say, in word and hopefully in deed. But it's an incredibly dangerous place to work. When there was no ceasefire, you would have to get clearance to move from A to B all the time. You're moving in armoured vehicles, you're moving in flak jackets. We're well aware of how many United Nations staff have been killed there. So for all colleagues on the ground, be they Palestinian, be they international, from whichever UN agency or whichever non-government organisation, just Palestinian Red Crescent and so on, incredible workers, very, very brave workers. And yeah, it is the most dangerous, difficult place to be a humanitarian worker.
I'm sure it is. What's the situation like, though, in places like Sudan or Haiti? I mean, Haiti is now run by criminal gangs. Sudan, we see in Al-Fashir and other areas, the rapid support forces. Those are also very unsafe places. What's it like for your colleagues in UNICEF? And you've been to both of these places yourself, actually.
Yeah, so it really is something about Gaza, just in that proximity. I have no military background, but after a while in Gaza, you start to learn how close it is at 2:00 in the morning. How close the bomb was, based on how, to what degree the windows shuttered and so on. So there is something unlike any other conflict zone with the consistency of that. And there's something that's very strange about Gaza as well, because you run into all kinds of personal guilt there, because I put a pillow over my head in the middle of the night to simply try and sleep, because I need to sleep a little bit through the bombardments. But then I'm aware that 200 meters away there's a 7-year-old girl sleeping in a tent without any of that level of safety. So it's a very contradictory place in that sense, which is probably one of the things, as you mentioned earlier, Talal, what keeps you going. That sort of things does. You double down and realize how important the work is. Places like Haiti, yeah, I mean, yes, as you say, 80% plus of the capital city is controlled by gangs. So when I went to Haiti, you fly in by helicopter. It's really the only safe way in. You land at a helipad. You're met straight away by armed people. You put into an armored vehicle. You constantly, as we go around, the whole point of me being in a place is to talk to people and to listen to people, is to see our projects in water, is to go and see the schools, is to go and see the immunisation clinics. But that means we're on the ground for a limited amount of time. They want to make sure that how long would it take for gangs to be aware that someone is there. So incredibly difficult place to work. But again, that's the level of security around me. For a nurse in Haiti, those frontline health workers, they don't have any of that. They don't have those escorts. So, when I meet nurses who some of them would have a gun walking to work and then put it in a locker at a hospital and then go to work all day. Those are the frontline people that deserve endless respect. And yet, right now, this biggest crisis everyone is facing, those people do that, they somehow survive, and then their biggest problem is in fact a funding crisis. And whether it's Haiti or the Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan, even Gaza, we are facing the biggest funding crisis in the history of humanitarian aid. And that's directly on the back of massive funding cuts around the world. And so when I talk to a nurse in Sudan or a doctor in Haiti, that you can't possibly explain to them why this is happening. There is no principled reason why it's happening. There's no practical reason why it's happening. We talked about education before. There is no better dollar you can possibly spend than educating a child. But on one hand, we see multilateralism under threat and international humanitarian law under threat. On the other, we see the biggest funding cuts in history happening right now to the most vulnerable, which of course, is a double problem, because you're cutting budgets for healthcare in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been the epicenter of outbreaks of Ebola, of Mpox, of cholera. You know, it's crazy to think that diseases know borders when it comes to funding cuts. It's like we've suddenly forgotten how quickly a few sneezes will bring the world to its knees, as we did with COVID. So this is the worst time in humanitarian work, and that's who does that hurt? That hurts the partners on the ground, that hurts the brave people working for next to nothing in villages, and most importantly, that just hurts girls and boys and who have no understanding whatsoever why suddenly the food rations have been cut, or the teachers are no longer there, or there's no vaccines.
If you could explain it to our listeners as best as you can. I know you just said it's a very hard thing to explain, but why is the world backing away from causes like this?
There's no economic reason for it. We're talking about less than a single % of GDP. So there's no economic reason for it. Politically, one imagines that, as crises expand more and more, people are turning inward. I don't think people in a lot of countries understand exactly just how little money we are really talking about as well. Frequently, governments feel they're not going to lose votes based on cutting foreign aid. And then there's a responsibility on people like myself. We have to make sure that people understand the impact of education on children, how you educate a child, and then how that gives you a tenfold return in that community and that village, that community in 10 years' time. We have to teach how that when you vaccinate in one place, you are protecting many, many other places. Those lessons, maybe they haven't come through, but I think mostly people feel that too much money is being spent on foreign aid, but it is the smallest budgetary output for most countries, and they're cutting more. So what does that mean, Talal? I think it means that we have to check our empathy. We have to revisit to what degree we've lost a little bit of empathy for those who are less fortunate than ourselves. And because of my work, I think there can be a sense in some countries whereby people feel that people are waiting for humanitarian aid. They've got their hand out. I've really never seen that. People on the margins who have suffered a flood or a drought or a war have done everything. They've got all the qualities we would like, as a person in Oman or in Australia would like. They're hardworking. They look after their family. They're resolute. They've got all those things, but they've through no fault of their own, they need that, what we'd say in Australia, they need that leg up. They need some sort of support. So, people who are on the margins, who are desperately in need of humanitarian aid, are not there with their hand out. They've done everything possible, but everything's gone against them. And now, all of a sudden, the world has turned its back as well.
Then back to your expertise, the children. What is one thing from being on the ground that you've heard children tell you they need? Not agencies, not experts, not this. What is the number one thing children say themselves that they need?
Yeah. I mean, I think to a particular child, it's always... because I so frequently meet children who have been literally under attack, right? So whether it was in Ukraine with millions fleeing, or Sudan the same, or Gaza under the most atrocious daily attack, they don't say it in the word of childhood, but that's what they're referring to. Kids just want a normal day. Kids are incredibly resilient, but they want that little bit of normal life again. They want to be able to play, and to play for a child as well. Remembering to play is to be in school, which is quite funny. Most kids think that having a day out of school is fantastic. So I mean, if I look at one particular boy, almost not the first child I met in Gaza when I was there in November 2003, but the first child I met in Gaza, who I still keep in touch with today because he's still alive. Omar's now 11, he was 9. And I met him, and his mum and dad have been killed in an airstrike, and his twin brother. So he'd lost his mum and his dad and his twin brother in an airstrike. And we were talking through his auntie, and she had perfect English, as so many Palestinians there do. And this little boy, Omar, has these piercing blue eyes, they're captivating. But he was opening up. He was explaining, how he was doing in the horror that he had. And he kept closing his eyes though as well. And I would notice that, of course. And I said to his auntie, why? Why does Omar keep closing his eyes? And she just said, look, he says he's aware that he's lost his mum and his dad, but he really just wants to keep picturing them. He doesn't want to lose the image of them in his eyes. The point is there, he just wanted to try and remember a bit of normality, just a bit of regular life. So whether a kid has been in a village in Sudan or a nice home in Kyiv in Ukraine or a beautiful apartment in Gaza, when they've lost all that, they're looking for that little bit of life again. And for so many children who are really under attack, they don't just lose access to school, they don't just lose access to safety, they watch their parents lose the level to protect them. And that's one of the most terrifying things for children to realise. When a child looks into their parents' eyes and realises that their mum and dad can no longer protect them, when a mum or dad realises they've lost that ability to protect their child, that's when I think things feel very, very unstuck. So not in so many words, because I talk to 4-year-olds and 17-year-olds. 17-year-olds, of course, will be more articulate, but all of them are just seeking that most basic thing of a childhood. And childhood is just safety, chance to play, couple of meals a day and going to school. But those things have been ripped away for more children, as you and I speak today, Talal, than at any time in the last few decades.
What do you hope is going to come next for these conflicts? I know it's a very broad and big question, but is there a shift that you think might happen to help these areas? And if there is a shift, where might that shift be?
Yeah, what a great question. I think at the moment, we have to be honest that we're seeing wars last a lot longer. And so that's a really concerning shift. And states need to become much more involved to advocate and lobby for peace, and not ensure that their self-interest doesn't ultimately turn into something that is regionally problematic. So wars are going for longer. What I ultimately hope, in a very simple sense, is that people go back to the basics of understanding just how critical this generation is, just how critical, that all grandparents are going to be looked after by younger people, that ultimately all the teachers are going to be today's teenagers and so on, that people understand the absolute criticality of this generation. And it's a generation right now that, even if you're not facing war, and so many children aren't, thankfully, let's be clear, a lot of children aren't, but that's a generation looking at a mental health crisis on the back of COVID-19. That's a generation well aware that there is climate change affecting them. So it's a very, very literate generation. It's a generation that's had more access to information than any before them. So my hope is that they are able to use that information, sift through that information, find what's true in that information, and then use that in a way that doesn't just help them, but helps their neighbour. And if we go back to that idea that, what benefits my neighbour benefits myself, be your neighbour the house next door or the country next door, then we might return to a place we were a few decades ago and not feel the last 50 years has been an anomaly.
Truly hope so. James, you're the spokesperson for UNICEF. And right now you're speaking to the people of Oman. What is any message that you'd like to get across to your average day citizen of the world right now? The floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Talal. Look, it's my first day in Oman, so I'm just pleased to be here. But a country like this that, has a reputation for goodwill, that has wealth, you would like to just think that it is one of empathy and of generosity. As I say, going back to our very first few minutes of speaking, realizing sometimes that the lottery of birth and the good fortune of that. And then what do we do with our good fortune? What's the benefit of having it? And looking at your neighbor, whether it's your neighbor down the street or whether it's your neighbor in a neighboring country, and working out how we can help them. And yes, that can sound like money. And for UNICEF, got to be honest, Talal, UNICEF is, we have the broadest mandate of any United Nations agency, and none of that is, none of the work we do comes from a magic pot of money. Everything is donor driven. Everything comes from the generosity of people. So to me, it does come back to whether it's volunteering, whether it's giving to a local community down the road, whatever it may be, just appreciating, having that gratitude, teaching our children what they have to be grateful for, and helping anyone understand what those less fortunate don't have and how we might, in our small way, help them.
Thank you very much, James.
Pleasure, Talal. Great to talk.
Appreciate your time. And we wish you the best in your oncoming journey. And we hope that we see great change, inshallah. Much of it driven by people like yourself who are there on the ground making sure things are on their way to getting better. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks, Talal.